Ever feel like you're on one of those roller coasters? The kind where, like, the highs are amazing, but then the lows, they kind of hit you harder than you thought possible?
Mm.
Well, today we're diving deep into borderline personality disorder, BPD, and specifically how it shows up in relationships.
Yeah, and even if you're thinking, DPD, that's not really my thing, I think this deep dive, it's still got something for you. Because let's face it, we've all been totally overwhelmed by our emotions at some point, right?
Oh, absolutely. So before we get into all that, let's break down what BPD actually is, in a way that actually makes sense.
Right, because there's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding out there. Like, at its core, BPD is really about intense emotional dysregulation.
Okay, so not just like, oh, they're being moody, this is something else.
Exactly. It's about the strength of those emotions, experiencing them much more intensely than what might be considered typical, and then often, struggling to manage all of that.
So it's not even necessarily about the actual emotion, it's the power behind it.
Exactly.
Wow. And I'm guessing we can all relate to that on some level, right? Those days where, like, you're already stressed and then the tiniest thing just sets you off.
Oh, yeah. Now imagine feeling that way, that kind of heightened sensitivity almost all the time. That gives you a little window into what someone with BPD might be going through.
Wow. Okay, that puts it into perspective. But it still makes me wonder, like, what is it that makes those emotional responses so strong in the first place? Is it like a brain thing?
It is. It's actually a super fascinating mix of, like, nature and nurture. Research is showing there are some differences in how the brain is actually wired in people with BPD.
Interesting.
Yeah. Think about it like this. You know how sometimes you have these reactions that feel almost automatic?
Like you don't even think about it, you just react.
Exactly. That's your amygdala, the part of your brain that's all about processing emotions, kicking into gear. And with BPD, it's like that amygdala is on overdrive.
Oh, wow. So it's almost like their brains are like pre-wired to experience emotions more intensely right from the start.
That's what it seems like. And to make it even more complicated, the prefrontal cortex, the part that's supposed to be all logical and help us think things through, well, it often struggles to keep up with that supercharged amygdala.
Oh, no. So it's like trying to reason with like a runaway train of emotions.
That's a great way to put it. It can feel incredibly overwhelming. And of course, it's not just about the brain, right? Our psychology, all that stuff, that plays a role too, especially in relationships.
This is where like those early experiences come in, right? And maybe even things like past trauma.
You got it.
Yeah.
Like, imagine growing up in an environment where you never really felt safe, or where your emotional needs, they weren't consistently met.
Man, that would make it so much harder to learn how to, like, regulate your own W emotions as you grow up.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And that can unfortunately lead to this cycle where those early experiences then kind of fuel these really intense fears of rejection or abandonment in adult relationships.
Which makes total sense when you think about it. If you've never had that secure emotional base, it's got to be so tough to create that stability in yourself and then your relationships too. Okay, so we're starting to see how all these things connect, right? The brain's wiring, those early experiences, and then this really deep fear of abandonment. But what does this actually look like in everyday life? And when we're talking about BPD's impact on relationships, I'm curious about something in the material we have about Claire. There's that whole thing about her getting upset over the dishes, which honestly feels relatable even if you don't have BPD.
Oh, yeah, the dish-tastrophe. That's such a good example of how, even something that seems small can become a huge deal, especially when you're dealing with the emotional intensity of BPD.
So the dishes weren't really the point, were they?
Right. It often comes back to those underlying fears of, like, rejection or invalidation, even abandonment. And those can get triggered by, honestly, the smallest thing.
Wow. So for someone with BPD, it's not about being difficult on purpose or overreacting. It's more about this deep fear that those core needs, they're not being met.
Exactly. And that's exactly why understanding BPD is so crucial. It's about recognizing that those emotional responses, they're coming from a very real place, a painful place often, their internal experience.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So we've kind of laid the groundwork here for what BPD is and what causes it. Now let's talk about what you can do about it. Like, if you're listening and you're thinking, this is me or this is my partner, where do you even begin?
Ah, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? But the good news is there are things you can do. And it really starts with a little bit of a mindset shift. Instead of trying to fix the person with BPD, think about it more like, you're there to support them, support their journey of, self-discovery and learning how to regulate their emotions. Remember, they are the expert on their own experience.
So less about fixing, more about growing together.
Yes,
Got it.
exactly. And one really powerful tool for that growth, communication. But like mindful communication.
Okay.
And this goes both ways, right? So the person with BPD, they can learn to communicate what they're feeling. And on the flip side, their partner can learn to respond in a way that's supportive without like getting swept up in that emotional storm themselves.
Right. We've all been there. Maybe not about the dishes specifically, but that feeling of, okay, I really need to choose my words carefully right now. Easier said than done, right?
Oh, 100%. It takes practice and patience and a lot of self-awareness from both people, but it's so worth it.
So where do you even begin?
Well, for the person with BPD, learning to use I statements can be a game changer.
Okay.
So instead of saying like, you always make me feel worse, it's more like, hey, I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now. Can we maybe talk about this a bit later?
Oh, that's good. So it's about like owning your experience rather than placing blame.
Exactly, you got it. And then for the partner, it's about really, truly listening, not just waiting for your turn to speak, validating those feelings, even if you don't totally get them, that can make a world of difference.
It's like saying, hey, I see you, I hear you, and what you're feeling is valid, even if I might react differently to this situation.
Yes. And remember, validating isn't about agreeing, right? You can totally validate how someone's feeling without saying that, like, their behavior is okay. It's about kind of that balance, finding that sweet spot between empathy and setting healthy boundaries.
Okay, so we're talking about this balance we need to find, right? Honoring those big feelings, but still setting boundaries. It's like this constant dance, isn't it?
It is, and sometimes we step on each other's toes, but those boundaries, they're so important for both people.
Totally.
Yeah.
So how does that actually work? Can you walk me through it?
Sure. So for the person with BPD, it might be helpful to start by figuring out their triggers. Like, what are the things that tend to set them off?
Right, identify those landmines.
Exactly. And then, even more important, having a plan. Like, okay, when those feelings start getting really intense, what am I going to do that?
So it's like, all right, I know if I'm feeling ignored, that's a big one for me. So what can I do to like feel grounded in that moment instead of just reacting?
You've got it. It's being proactive instead of reactive. And for the partner, setting boundaries might look like taking space when things get a little too heated, or even just communicating their own needs and what their limits are.
Right, because you can't pour from an empty cup. Taking care of yourself so you can actually be there for the other person.
100%. And it's not about, abandoning the person with BPD. It's actually a form of self-preservation. So you can be the best partner you can be. And honestly, speaking of taking space, that can be so, so important when you're navigating those really intense moments. Like those blow-ups we were talking about.
Right, yeah. So what do you do when you feel that emotional storm brewing?
Yeah.
Or even when it's like full-on hurricane mode?
In those moments, sometimes the best thing you can do is create some space for things to de-escalate. Remember those timeout periods?
Yeah.
Those aren't just for prevention. They can be essential when things are already heated.
Oh, that's a good point. So instead of trying to like hash it out when you're both fired up, you take a step back, cool off, and then revisit the conversation later.
Exactly. And for the person with BPD, that means being able to recognize those early warning signs. Those little physical sensations or those thought patterns that tell you things are starting to escalate.
So it's like catching it at like a 7 instead of waiting till you're at a 10.
Exactly. It's about, taking responsibility for your own well-being. And then for their partner, it's about respecting that need for space, not taking it personally and, definitely not chasing after them, trying to fix it.
Because as tempting as it is to try to smooth things over in the moment, sometimes the best thing, the most loving thing even, is to just give them the space they need to work through those emotions, which takes trust, right?
Oh, for sure. And that trust, it's built over time through those little interactions where you're showing up for each other, honoring those boundaries.
It's about kind of proving to each other, hey, we're in this together for the long haul. Okay, so we've got creating space, we've got setting boundaries. What are some other tools couples can use to weather those emotional storms?
One that's so important, but people often forget about it, is self-soothing. These are the things you can do to kind of like calm your nervous system down, help you regulate those emotions, especially when it feels like everything's chaotic.
Okay, I like it. Give me the goods. What are some like go-to self-soothing techniques?
Oh man, there's so many. Deep breathing is a classic, but for good reason. It's super simple, but it works.
In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8, like a magic spell.
Right. And there's other stuff too. Mindfulness practices, grounding techniques, anything that helps you feel more grounded, really. Could be listening to music, going for a walk, getting out in nature, whatever works for you.
Love it. So it's about having a whole, toolkit of
Yeah.
different things you can try. And then when those emotions start bubbling up, you've got options.
You got it. And the more you practice these techniques, the easier it becomes to access them in those heated moments. But remember, this is a journey, not like a quick fix. It's about learning and growing together, one step at a time.
And that is a perfect note to end on. So much of navigating BPD and relationships, or really any relationship, comes down to understanding, compassion, patience. And really, it's about shifting from blame to support, from fear to hope.
That's beautifully said. Even in the middle of those storms, there's always that little beacon of hope, guiding us towards calmer waters.
And sometimes, working through those storms, as hard as it is, it can bring you closer, build a love that's stronger because it's been tested.
That's such a good point.
And on that note of hope and resilience, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into BPD and relationships. We've covered a lot today. The challenges, the complexities, but most importantly, we talked about the possibilities. The possibilities for healing and for growth. Keep exploring, keep learning, and as always, keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.